How does a black woman become an ambassador for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? This is a question that I have evaded for many years, in part because it is an uncomfortable conversation to have, but also because I'm an Aries and I'm stubborn and I don't feel like I should have to explain, not to the people who look like me, not to the millions of people who come to the Holocaust Museum every year, not even to the people whose history I am an ambassador for. This is my choice, and I want the answer to be that simple, even though I know that it isn't. There's two answers to the question of how, and the first is interest, the second is opportunity. But when we evaluate the question of how does a black woman or why does a black woman become an ambassador for the Holocaust Museum, we see that it's one that requires me to defend my choice, my passion, my ideals. And again, that's something that I never wanted to do. But I do understand the magnitude in answering that question. And I also realize that I defend myself all the time. I'm a poet. And without anyone asking, I will sit down to write a poem. I will defend why I taught for 7 years. I defend why I stopped teaching after 7 years. I defend why I love who I love, anything that my heart desires. So I decided what better way to defend or explain my position as an ambassador than to write a poem. And this poem is entitled An Unlikely Voice. I am not the likely voice of a Holocaust survivor. And I presume that according to perspective, there are more likely torchbearers in this room. One might assume that a black woman with a tragic history of her own might not relate so heavily to this history, but wrong is wrong. Injustice speaks volumes no matter what side of the belief system or color line you were on. I remember as a senior in my high school history class learning about the Holocaust in what appeared to be one day. I remember being unable to walk away. I was so intrigued by how little my textbook had to say, and then I learned of an opportunity at the museum to become involved. So for 12 years, I've resolved to speak out against the evils of this world, because in speaking for one, I indeed speak for all. I know that the evils of this world never sleep. And if I don't speak out for others, there'll be no one left to speak for me. I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King's dream, and Elie Wiesel reminds me that the world must remember. So for 12 years, I committed to this history. On my college campus, in my poetry, with my own students, I make sure that they get more than just one day. I give them the lesson of a lifetime. And I am reminded that this story is mine, that there is no such thing as a likely voice, that I must bear witness that silence can never be my choice. So, well, thank you. That poem was written for a museum program recently. The story of how I became an ambassador has been told several times at the Holocaust Museum. And in preparation for this huge program, I was asked to read a script about my story, and I asked instead if I could simply write that poem. But poetry is my most effective means of communication. First of all, because it's uninterrupted. So I can get on the stage and say whatever it is that I want to say for however long I have. And I'm responsible with that privilege. But also because I can pack so much into a condensed form. So in a poem that was less than 2 minutes, I was able to explain my interest in the museum, how I became involved, and what I've been doing for the last 3 years. That poem is usually performed in front of a room of World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors and their families. And recently I had the privilege to share that in front of President Bill Clinton and Elie Wiesel, who's actually quoted in the poem. And as amazing as the journey has been, the most memorable moment for me was when a Holocaust survivor came to me after that poem. She grabbed my hand and she said, "I haven't talked to anyone about what happened, but you've inspired me, and I'm going to start talking." And I figured that if this woman who was holding secrets for decades could decide to start talking, then perhaps I could start answering the difficult question of how does a black woman become an ambassador for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So I'm a black woman who knows more about the Holocaust than she does her own history. civil rights, slavery combined. And that's a different conversation for a different day. There's a disparity of opportunities like this one for me in that arena. But it is an interest that led to an opportunity. When I was a senior in high school, I joined a program called Bringing the Lessons Home at the Holocaust Museum. It was conceived in 1994. It is a partnership between the museum and high schools in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, where when students tour, they're then eligible to apply for a leadership program. Study the history, tour your family and friends through the museum as graduation, and then you become an ambassador. And there are 700 ambassadors just like myself who are charged to go out into their unique communities and to reach at least 100 people a year, who have in turn helped to reach hundreds of thousands of people through this particular history. So I too studied for 15 weeks and I toured my family, and I operated in different capacities at the Holocaust Museum, even as a student here at Towson University. I came to Towson in 2001. I was a member of the Black Student Union, and I convinced the Black Student Union, the VSU, to come together with Hillel, our Jewish Student Association, to do a series of things. So we took a joint trip to the Blacks in Wax Museum in Baltimore, and we took a joint trip to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we ended the month by having Shabbat dinner in the Hillel office. And it was a confusing and beautiful situation. But like most of the young people that come through the museum, it's usually after those types of conversations that people do get it. My job is always to create space for a conversation as an ambassador. And so I have toured teachers, students, police officers, friends. I'll tweet who wants a tour at the museum and my friends will show up. It's the coolest thing ever. But I've had conversations about the Holocaust with Muslims and Christians, Hispanics, Blacks, whites. And it's always a conversation of peace and justice, and what group doesn't want the privilege of peace and justice? So it's important work that I do, and I realized that I can't not answer the question. But I do want to end with another poem that I wrote for another museum event. All these things are tied together. This one was rather unfortunate, but a gunman entered the institution a few years ago, opened fire, killing one of our beloved security guards, Officer Stephen T. Johns. And that year, the program, Bringing the Lessons Home, decided to dedicate its Tier 1 or first cohort of ambassadors by naming them the Stephen T. Johns Ambassadors. I was asked to come and write a poem to, I guess, commemorate the naming of the group. And so I wrote this, but before I do share it, it's heavily linked to a quote at the end of the permanent exhibition at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, one that I've carried as an ambassador, one that has influenced the first poem and the second poem, and that is a quote by Martin Niemöller. And I paraphrase, but it says, "First they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me." And so I will close with my own words, which would be a poem entitled "Light Up the Darkness." The legendary Bob Marley spoke, and I quote, "The people who tried to make this world worse never take a day off, so why should I?" So he'd decide to light up the darkness with his voice and the guitar at his side. He spoke positive vibes into every available ear. He sang love loud enough to eradicate fear. He played melodies strong enough to bring the people near, and the world knew his purpose. Even those who disagreed heard it because his fans rehearsed it. It was amplified and reverbed, then mass-produced, mulled over, remixed, dubbed over. He could not be deterred. Not even by the assassin's bullet that left him hurt. It had no power to silence his words. 2 days later, he returned back to work with messages of peace and justice when the world was at its worst. He knew that his purpose was greater than the melodies that he played. Evil will try to silence good. It will emerge in all of its ugliness to convince us to not do what we should. It operates in fear. It will try to muffle the love in our hearts by placing poison in our ear. It's the reason why we are here. Searching for better days and better ways. The importance of the messages that we utter, the respect and the love that we show for one another. It is all to counteract that which does not rest. The hatred that lodged a bullet in Dr. Martin Luther King's neck, that exploded several times in Malcolm X's chest, that took millions across the Middle Passage and then would double back to Africa, the hatred that swung black bodies on thin lines in southern trees, that gassed and burned millions in Germany, that walked up into a crowded institution in DC with hopes to destroy a vision, with a desire to deter those of us who might be watching and listening, just as it attempted to silence this musician, who had the power to influence an audience to move in the right direction, just like everyone in this room. It is you, powerful beyond all measure, because of the work that you do. Keep looking towards the light, because the evil in this world does not rest at night. And you must decide, say to yourself, if evil can move with such determination, then so can I. Thank you.